So, what does it mean to be a good professional? Is it the person with the most credentials, the most knowledge, or the business with the most work, or the cheapest work? Well, really, it could be any of those, or really none of those. The question is, what role does ethics play in everyday work, professional, or personal life? And really, the answer is whatever the company has established combined with your personal code. My name's Lindsay Purcell, and I'm the Urban Forestry Specialist at Purdue University in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. And today we're in this presentation, we're going to talk about professionalism and ethics. And those are two very important buzzwords right now. We all know that they're important, yet in our behavior, we often or unconsciously or deliberately overlook some of those things in pursuit of short-term benefits. So next we're going to take a look at some scenarios that help drive this presentation.
All right. So, ethically speaking, what do you think? So, put yourself in this position. How would this be addressed where you work? Now, I'm going to go through a few scenarios here that, as I mentioned earlier, help drive this presentation and just kind of see what you think and how this would be addressed at your place of business. All right, first of all, you're made aware of company employee ghosting applications. Now, if you don't know what that means, that kind of pertains to the lawn care company where I've actually seen and had reported to me where the operator applicator will park the truck, go up and put the stamp on the or the sticker in the lawn or on the door and walk away. Prescribing a treatment for a client's tree, knowing it will be ineffective. And I've often heard this be a typical example of perhaps a fungicide application on trees for absolutely no purpose at all. You witness a foreman recutting stumps to appear as newly removed trees on a veg management project for extra billing. This was, I thought, probably the most creative one that I've ever seen. Performing tree work without insurance or a ghost policy. This is especially critical for those people who are hiring companies without insurance and unaware of the vulnerabilities should somebody from that company be injured on their property. I'm not recommending a service because you are unable to provide it, even though it's critically needed. Now, just because you can't do it doesn't mean that you should not prescribe that service and perhaps subcontract it or recommend another company who can provide that service. Again, we're advocating for the tree here. Discovery of the branch manager turning in a time card for an employee that doesn't even exist. Yeah. And then someone on your crew is stealing company equipment, which is certainly not a surprise. So again, think about where you work and how would this be handled. Are ethics in the company approached as punitive or proactive? And that's what we're going to talk about in this presentation is the framework that I have kind of mashed together with a combination of several things, three primarily important components. First of all, it builds upon the ISA Code of Ethics, which binds us to the human dimension. And it is important as a member of the organization. But this framework that I'm going to talk about takes it a step further. It's about the tree as well. So we're going to look at ethical practice based on the ISA Code of Ethics. I've also adapted the Hippocratic Oath to arboricultural principles, which I think you might find interesting. And then, of course, to finish off, we're going to look at the application of the basic law of care. It's science-based. It's interactive with the patient, which is our tree, and translates a positive message to the client. So let's start with the business end of things and the professional arborist. Now, ethics has been basically a science of conduct, a topic of philosophy for over 2,500 years, since the days of Socrates and Plato. Ethics comes from the Greek word ethos, which discusses what I like to call the three B's, that of being, which is talking about your character, behaving, which is your decision-making principles, and that of becoming or flourishing as a person, as an individual. Now, ethics should be included when talking any kind of business. It's as important as the practice itself. Ethics are essentially the guidelines a company uses when interacting inside and outside the company, and often missing in many businesses because it isn't a typical content of the employee handbook. Typically, we don't list the behavioral expectation. That's considered the moral code. One of the things I like to look at is the difference between the internal and external customer. Now, we all know the importance of taking care of the external customer, the people who purchase our product or services. But successful organization recognize the importance of taking care of the internal customer, and that's the employees. So what I encourage you to do is take some time as the leader in your company or the manager just to silently witness what is going on each morning when crews are getting ready, or each evening in the shop when they're coming back or in the office. See what the conversations, the relationships are, the courtesies, the attitudes are going on inside your company. This is management of the internal customers. They have a direct link to those external customers and the quality of that product or service that you're providing. So whether the internal customer is the receptionist or the person answering the phone, remember this, the supply chain starts there. So it's don't overlook anyone. Moving on up to the branch manager or the sales rep, every person in the supply chain is important to delivering a great product or service. So if that company culture of ethics is broken or less productive here, imagine what the external customer is seeing or receiving. The decision to behave ethically is typically considered a moral one, and it's often said to be guided by that moral compass. The thing is, your moral compass really can only point you in the right direction. It can't make you go there. Ethics is something that is learned and chosen throughout one's life. And as I said earlier, you really have it or you don't. And simply put, ethics involves learning what is right and wrong and then doing the right thing. It's about consistency with these situations. If any of those scenarios, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, made you think it depends, well, that's kind of a red flag. Ethical business is about acting without bias, and it shouldn't be situational in your business activities. The attitudes and the culture of the company where you work influences the attitudes around you, and those transcends to the client and their perception about you and the company you represent. So decisions taken within an organization may be made by individual or groups, but whoever makes them will be influenced by the entire company culture. So ethics and organizational success really go hand in hand. The value-driven companies are always going to be successful in the long run and continue to be successful with a workforce that is committed, engaged, and very capable. Now, the real question is by the time employees hit the workforce or by the time that recruit comes to work for you, can they be taught things like ethics or is it too late? That's what we need to think about is that process. Well, let's look at some of the issues that we may run across here. These are statistics from the National Business Ethics Survey. Over 40% of the workers observed on the job ethics violations, and 63 reported those violations. And the unfortunate thing is nearly a quarter of those experienced retaliation. So you can see that there's an issue there with not being perceived as a team player or a tattletale or whatever definitive remark you want to make there. But again, that's what's going to have an impact on the corporate culture. I think one of the most disturbing parts of this is over 60% of the workplace misconduct involve managers. So the question is, why are high-level employees more likely to behave unethically? Well, I think the answer is really that they have more opportunities to overstep the rules, or they may be under more pressure to show results. And knowing how hard it is to achieve some goals that are presented to them, they may be more willing to explain away those questionable means. So senior staff and managers behaving morally upright manner will set an example for all the employees to follow. The good news is that the National Business Ethics Survey did show that the incidence of workplace misconduct has been trending downward over the last few years. So that kind of implies that there's a better focus on ethical culture combined with ethics and compliance programs, and that does help reduce the opportunities for misconduct. According to a few people, ethics can be taught, while some say, well, it depends on how a person has been raised, if he or she was made to distinguish between morally right and being ethically wrong. Well, if we believe that, then this statement basically demonstrates that any ethics course that you attend or online are virtually useless. But psychologists agree today that ethics consists of knowing what we ought to do, and that knowledge can be taught. Professionalism is the conduct, behavior, and attitude of a person in a work or corporate environment. Professionalism can indeed be taught, and it has been for centuries. You can only understand your organizational goals and their culture if you talk to everybody, not just senior staff. I think that's one thing that's overlooked is oftentimes the training stops at the midpoint going through the hierarchy of your managers and staff. Now, it's important that certainly senior staff be trained, but they often only talk to each other and not to the crew and the other staff. So ethics should be a regular conversation in any training event and all inclusive. Be sure to encourage an environment in which all people at all levels can speak during your training programs and without fear of retaliation. That equitable environment will really bring out the best in your employees and also your company. Convince staff that high ethical standards make them better at what they do. Provide this ongoing training. Use case studies, as I just gave you a few of those earlier, in your own workplace so that people won't automatically think, oh, this could never happen to me. Owners, managers, supervisors, they all set the tone when they talk about doing the right thing with staff, but their actions speak loudest when they model that proper professional ethical behavior. Whether facing minor quandaries or major problems, they can constantly raise the question, what does our organizational values tell us about how to handle these decisions? And this makes ethics very real and tangible. If you're able to discuss this in your training programs and use these scenarios, then there's no guesswork here. And you can be sure that you can hold each person accountable consistently throughout the organization. Ethics isn't just a business thing. It's a personal and a religious thing as well. The list that you see here includes just some of the qualities found in ethical business or as a professional. I think the important thing here is making sure that you hold people accountable that work for you or within your organization for demonstrating these behaviors on an escalating path, raising the bar for excellence, safety, and production as they proceed throughout their career. Typically, there's a bit of confusion when we have an apparent lack of ethics, especially when it overrides the profits. When profit is viewed and embraced as the sole purpose of that company or that business, it completely distorts and corrupts the whole process. However, corporate purpose built on quality relationships based on trust with the customer and employees inspires the highest levels of ethical leadership and success. Can't say that enough. When you build those quality relationships on trust with customers, employees, that's when success and growth really occurs. And I've seen it personally happen. Now, regarding performance feedback, this is often a critical moment in the relationship between employers and employees. And how you do it makes all the difference in what happens after that employee leaves the doors. I like to remember the three P's: private, prompt, and progressive. I managed tree crews for many years, and those were successful protocols for handling right and wrong behavior when it came to the workplace. So when discussing ethics and behavior, make sure you're clear in your language and your message and the expectations. So there's no room for interpretation. Clearly, consistently, and frequently communicate those behaviors that we want and that are important to the organization. It's so much easier to train people on how to behave as opposed to telling them how not to behave, because usually the damage has already been done. I think one of the most profound statements that I recently read is communicating meaning and intention is essential. And the words that we use are just a means to that end. So I think sincere care in the person and the organization makes all the differences and is palpable and perceptible. Exemplary behavior should be recognized and used as a teaching and training tool every day. This builds a team and the image of the company and creates incredible levels of loyalty within the crew and the staff. Kudos are good for everyone, and everyone likes them. But it's also remember that those kudos and accolades are not just good for the person who's getting them, they're good for everyone. It creates an aspiration in others for positive attention. This is the best way I've found to build people and long-term employees. Typically, my discussions with former students and early career professionals boil down to it's really their discontent to one consistent statement. And I found that employees separate from their boss and not from their job. An organization where employees uphold the highest standards of professionalism and ethics is seen as an employer of choice. But in reality, it's not the awards and it's not the money that makes the person a better employer. Rather, it's the way you uphold your values in times of crisis and helps the organization get through those challenging times. Senior staff, crew leaders, managers, we all get it. We have the greatest responsibility and also the greatest visibility on the job. It can't be said enough. One of the best ways to implement and ensure ethical practice is from that top down approach for anything. Those at the top of a company are often seen as the role models for other employees. And if they are acting in a way that is unethical, inappropriate, then that lower level employee is going to follow suit. Clearly, consistently, and frequently communicate those desired behaviors. That's why they're important to that organization. All right, so this was just a small bit of what an organization and employees should do to build and maintain an ethical business. But now I'd like to get to the practice part of it, the second part of the framework. What about the ethical practice and the trees we steward in our environment? Enter the professional arborist, the modern arborist. Modern arboriculture is the practice and study of the care of trees and other woody plants in the landscapes. It's about the tree system, how it grows, how it defends itself, and survives through its life cycle. The modern arborist carries out the principles of our science, and our primary duty is to maintain a safe, healthy tree in an ethical and responsible manner. We've come a long way, and the responsibilities on us are even greater as the importance for healthy, safe, natural resources become obvious in these times, challenging times that we're facing right now. So, what do we have available to us to guide our profession and our efforts in arboriculture and urban forestry in a unified, consistent manner? Many of us have professional credentials which indicate a level of knowledge and skill set, such as the ISA certified arborist or the similar credentials that they provide. Now, this is a very important to our organization and to our profession, and it guarantees a consistent body of knowledge across our industry and a connection with the industry and our peers. But again, just as importantly to me is there really isn't anything which thoroughly connects us to our patient, which is the tree. And when it comes to responsibility of care for those trees, As I mentioned, the Code of Ethics addresses the very important human dimensions things. We have responsibilities to the ISA, to our profession, as far as representation in public and with our clients, and our interaction between employers and employees. But let's talk about the trees. First, and very quickly, this is where ethical practice begins. The Ansi Standards and best management practices. The Ansi Standards represent the industry criteria for performing most of our tree care operations. And they can be used for general familiarity with professional requirements and practice, and especially that science-based practices that is used for many of our interventions. So this is the second part of the framework, and this is really the basis of it, the Hippocratic Oath. And this all started in a conversation with my wife over dinner, who's a healthcare practitioner. And what we found, and especially I noticed, was the amazing parallels between humans and trees, how strikingly similar they are. Both dynamic living organisms who respond to external stimuli in varying degrees. Now, a little bit about the Hippocratic Oath. It's the oldest binding document in history that was historically taken by physicians and other healthcare professionals, swearing to practice medicine honestly and requiring a strict loyalty to their peers. It was written by Hippocrates back in the BC days, but it was modernized in the 20th century by another physician. And this is what we typically refer to today. Now, this is where I believe we can build a responsible practice based on the tenets of the medical profession. It's what connects us to or connects the basic principles of arboriculture with an ethical directive. So let's take a look. Now, I believe there's like 13 tenets for the oath, and actually, all of them can be applied pretty closely, but we won't cover all of them. I'd like to cover just a few of what I think are the most critical ones that I notice and most applicable. Now, remember the oath, the Hippocratic Oath, and think about the oath as a professional in our industry, how the similarities appear. It's an oath of loyalty and honesty. It binds the practitioner to that greater body of professionals, and it creates a body of ethics for the good of the patient and the practice. All right, let's start with the first one. It's prevention. Now, in the Hippocratic Oath, I'm paraphrasing somewhat because the literature and the language is a little bit challenging. But basically, it says that I will prevent disease whenever I can, for the prevention is preferable to the cure. Prevention is better than cure represents an old horticultural adage that healthy plants don't get sick, which applies to trees and people. And generally, that's true. Environmental conditions that allow the tree to grow and develop in full health and vigor and without restriction will cope with most pests and diseases and stresses without the need for intervention. Think about the basic needs of a tree. Basically, it needs air, it needs water, and it needs space to grow, and a good soil medium. And with that, in the right quantities and in the right conditions, the tree can typically overcome any type of challenges. Now, in the built environment, it gets to be somewhat more challenging, and that's why trees need us in the urban forest. But key thing to remember here relative to prevention is that any intervention should be done with the idea of minimizing the spread of pests and diseases. So basic hygiene when dealing with trees that have been attacked by insects or diseases that can be sprayed on tools or clothing and equipment need to be considered here. And we are seeing this increasingly with especially your oak wilts and some of our more devastating insect pests, invasive pests that we are encountering today because of our global economy. Intervention. Basically, the Hippocratic Oath states that we should apply as physicians all measures required, but avoiding overtreatment. Oftentimes, we come with the idea that if a little good is good, then a lot is better. But that doesn't necessarily mean what we should be doing. Basically, when we put this into our practice, we want to apply all measures necessary, required to improve that tree's condition and avoid overtreatment. So the key thing is whatever you're doing, make sure you know what you're doing. Everything that we do should have clear, predictable outcomes. And if we don't know what we're doing, then just leave it alone. The tree is going to be a lot better off without us trying to interfere, especially if we don't know what we need to do. Attrition in the Hippocratic Oath, it means that we need to have an unbiased understanding that all trees cannot be saved, and nor should they. Recommendation of assessment and rescue treatments which are clearly of waste of money and misleading to the client relative to safety and reasonable expectations is the very essence of unethical practice. Remember, trees have useful functional lives, especially when we're talking about the built environment and not their native natural environment. The stressors and the challenges that imperil trees are growing every day. So we need to make sure that we consider the risk, but also consider the ROI or the return on the investment for that client, and making sure that we are providing the proper intervention for that situation. And yes, it may require removal. In some situations, again, not all trees can be saved, and nor should they. So we want to make sure that we partner and consider the client needs. Our responsibility is to provide the options, but ultimately it's the decision of the client on which strategy to choose and how they want to proceed with it. This is one of my favorites. Basically, the Hippocratic Oath states that I will not be ashamed to say I know not, nor will I fail to call in my colleagues when the skills of another are needed for a patient's recovery. Basically, what this is saying is there's just no shame in not knowing. And when I learned that, it took an incredible amount of pressure off of me. Because oftentimes, as certified arborists and credentialed professionals, we're expected to have in a second remedies and rescue treatments for the situation. But think about it. Consider yourself when you're visiting your physician. What are the expectations there? Does the doctor render a solution immediately without any research or facts? No. Listen to your heart rate, blood pressure. You may need blood tests or additional testing. The smartest man in the world doesn't know all the answers. He just knows how to find them. Being resourceful. Misinforming to protecting the ego is not only unethical, but it could be a litigious issue. If you don't know, it could cost you. So make sure you know when the situation exceeds your skills. So key thing is there that last statement that you see, don't misinform to protect the ego. Best thing to do is to say, look, I'm not sure of the answer right now. I'd like to research this and I'll get back to you within 24, 48 hours, whatever you feel is appropriate for that situation. That's the best way to maintain your integrity. Next is we belong to a society with an obligation of respect to our peers. Reputation is important to all of us. And really, I believe that the spotlight is now on us, and the world has a common concern, and that's the environment. The responsibility is huge, caring for the largest, oldest living legacies on our planet. And the opportunities are even greater to advance the importance and awareness of our industry. Reputation counts. You are always going to have some kind of reputation. So why not work on making it a good one? With that responsibility, there comes a need for an obligation to perpetuate and maintain honesty and integrity among our community of peers as well. Unethical behavior or lack of that professional responsibility damages all of our reputations. It is often irreparable damage that affects us all. I read once where Warren Buffett stated that it takes 20 years to build a reputation and less than 5 minutes to ruin it. So think about that. You probably do things differently. Let me show you some examples of representation. Now, remember, people tend to listen with their eyes much more than their ears. So what you do says a lot more than what you say oftentimes. Like the cowboy with no shirt and very little PPE, very little clothing for that matter, sent this to me as he was taking down this multi-stem maple. The Neanderthal man in the gym shorts and tank top. And I didn't realize that they made steel-toed Crocs, but apparently that's changed. Not just lack of PPE, but the lack of safety or concern, one arming it above his head, it just makes you tremble sometimes. And, stuff like this really makes me wince as well. I'm sure several of you have seen this come through the social media with the placing the arms and legs inside the chipper feeder table. And you wonder, why? This is one that I actually found from a news station after a storm. I think it was over in southern Illinois. Now, the key thing is there, look how close that guy's face comes to that chainsaw. And also the very fact that he had no idea how that tree was going to react whenever we remove that loading. So that's when I like to think about Mike Ditka on ESPN. Come on, man. Again, when we walk out of our door every day, we are like, I equate ourselves, and I tell my students, we're like a NASCAR. We have patches all of us. We represent our family. We represent ourselves, of course. We represent the organization we work for. We represent our church. We have a lot of representative responsibility, and I take that especially serious when it comes to our industry. It just takes one idiot like you've seen here or misinformed professional to damage the reputation and credibility of all of our career and passion with trees. And that's what I call representative responsibility. So, how the consumer sees you and your profession is how they see all of us. Now, a business can be seen as a single entity, but the actions of that company and many times just the single individual employee dictates how the organization is perceived by others in its entirety. It's how the consumer sees us all. We stereotype and judge based on the action of others. We hear it all the time. You see it with lawyers. Our industry has often been negatively stereotyped mistakenly by those misinformed consumers and misrepresentation by others. Now, do you want to see your tree crews looking like this? And believe me, we do. Or do you want to see that exemplary, unified image of a professional arborist at work? Again, this is what attracts people to our industry, not just for good business practices, but also it gets people intrigued about what are you doing? And not only what a great working environment. So this is the type of image that we want to see. It's certainly the type of image I want to represent me. Now, finally, I guess the last Hippocratic Oath tenet that I'd like to bring forward is, may I always act so to preserve the finest traditions of my calling. May I long experience the joy of healing those who seek my help. So basically, it's act to preserve the science and practice and enjoy the experience of your profession. There's a lot easier ways to make a living, but I don't know any others that are more fun. You know, Confucius said, if you enjoy what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. So I think it's important for us to always be tree evangelists and not only preach the importance of trees and the benefits they provide, but also preach the importance of that culture of safety and professionalism in our industry. And then, of course, the last part of the framework is the Dalai Lama and the basic law of care, which it could all be summed up into this one statement. So if you can't help, at least do no harm. Any arboricultural intervention shouldn't harm the tree. No intervention should contribute to making the condition of the tree any worse. We are environmental stewards. We are all urban foresters. If you plant a tree, maintain a tree, doesn't matter if it's on a city street, in a park, in a residence, we are all having a contribution and an impact on our urban forest. Environmental stewardship is about the responsible planning and management of resources, be they financial, environmental, or human. We are all stewards in some form or fashion. And also, when we make decisions on tree care, we should be making our decisions based on the biology rather than the business, and advocate for the tree and abide by those physiological demands of the trees. So I'm finishing up for the trees. Remember, trees are forgiving, but they do have their limits. We need to evaluate each intervention with science-based research and best management practices and consider all the impacts of our treatment decisions. And also establish that code which includes a responsibility of care. As arborists, if we break that down, arbor is Latin for trees, and the suffix ist means one who follows a particular doctrine or belief system or theory, or a person with a particular role or skill. Now, we all understand the application of care. That's the easy part in many cases. However, I think it's critically important that we understand what that responsibility of care is to the patient and the client, and doing the right thing ethically. Again, we are the advocates for trees, and if not us, then who will? Now, for us, just to recap what I talked about earlier in the presentation, develop an ethics program, make it a part of the overall mission and goals of the company. Research workplace needs. Again, look at that internal customer and see what's going on, and also watch what they're doing out there on the job to determine what kind of training's needed relative to this human resource, which is one of the most important that the organization has. And promoting involvement, as I mentioned earlier, it's a top-down approach from senior staff right down to the new hire. It's important to everyone because of that representative responsibility. And integrate ethics into that company culture. That's what makes a difference with not only good employers, but good employees. And communicate expectations fully, making sure there's no room for mistaken interpretation in those expectations that you're providing. Continuous training is always important. It's not repetition or redundant. It's just what people need to hear, again, on an escalating path, not the same thing, using case scenarios, engagement, and involvement. And true leadership, I believe, and I've read this from several passages in literature, leadership makes ethics a priority, not the net. When profit is viewed and embraced as the sole purpose of that company, as I mentioned earlier, it distorts and corrupts the whole process. That corporate purpose built on those quality relationship inspires that highest level of productivity.
So, what I presented here is my take on how to provide a framework which modern arboriculture can be practiced successfully, safely, and profitably. Now, these are just a few examples of injecting professionalism and ethics in our day to day interactions at work and in our personal dealings. It's also become evident that maintaining a professional and ethical mindset as individuals and as businesses will be vital for the future of our industry and your career. When companies set the tone with meaningful ethical and conduct standards, the results is a positive corporate culture where people want to go to work and clients keep coming back. Thank you.